of 100 vineyards, we didn't get a single one. On a random sampling basis, we didn't get a single sample that showed any response. Okay, next slide. Is that all of that particular? That's all of that. Okay, let's take a break. Everybody must be between potassium and magnesium, where one goes up and one goes down. And we have a rather interesting historical relationship to this. The most common deficiency that I've seen when I've traveled in Europe has been magnesium deficiency. Magnesium. We don't have it here, but anyway, minus magnesium in Europe. And you might ask, well, why do they have magnesium deficiency in Europe? Well, magnesium is likely to be rather low in areas where you have high rainfall and fairly acid soils. And this, of course, applies to Europe, so that you have a tendency toward low magnesium already. So you've already got magnesium down in this low level that, according to my sketch a while ago, you've got magnesium in European vineyards soil, something like this. But one of the students here brought up a question: is there any any similarity of symptoms of virus diseases and mineral nutrition deficiencies? And the most striking or clear-cut one of this type is the relationship between minus potassium, that meaning deficiency, and leaf roll virus. And it takes a pretty good expert to tell the difference between the two. I used to say only myself and Goheen, but that's sort of a little egotistical. But and not too many people can tell the difference just looking at vines. It's only between minus potassium and leaf roll virus. Because the symptoms on the leaves look just like potassium deficiency. And so far as the leaf blade is concerned, it is potassium deficiency. Because what happens in leaf roll virus is that it breaks down the conducting tissue in the petiole to the blade. About, here in California, about the first 2 weeks or so of July. So whatever potassium that blade's going to get has to be in it before the pipeline breaks. And if the pipeline breaks fairly early with a leaf roll virus, then the leaf blade is going to show potassium deficiency symptoms. And if you analyze the leaf blade, it's going to show low potassium. Now the Europeans in this whole business of tissue analysis over the years have worked with the idea of taking the whole leaf and its petiole as a sample. The leaf blade and its petiole. So, and the leaf blade outweighs the petiole about 5 or 6 to 1, so it has the dominating effect on whatever percentage you're going to find in the tissue. So we have here a rather classic illustration of how you can go wrong. Even though you think you got whole 4 aces, you can still lose. The vine showed potassium deficiency symptoms. The leaf tissue analysis showed low potassium. Applications of potassium partly, and there's the key point, partly alleviated the problem. Well, if you've got the symptoms of a disease, the tissue analysis shows it, and the treatment corrects it partly, aren't you home free? But you're not in the case of leaf roll virus. Because if you put on, you can have the symptoms, as I say, because of the conducting tissue breaking down in early summer, and therefore causing the deficiency symptoms on the blade. Where they analyzed the blade and the petiole together, with the blade outweighing the petiole 5 to 1, it still showed a low value of potassium. And when they put on high potassium, this meant that they were able to pump in quite a bit of potassium before the pipeline broke, so that it looked like they got partial remedy. And yet all the time they were working with a virus disease. And now what might happen in a country where you've got low magnesium to start with, and you pile on great amounts of potassium, thinking you're correcting potassium deficiency when you're working with a virus? What logically ought to occur? Extreme magnesium deficiency, and that's the most common symptom you see in Europe, brought about by applying high amounts of potassium to correct what they thought was potassium deficiency and was really leaf roll virus. So it shows you that no matter how safe you are, sometimes you aren't as safe as you think you are. So that was just what I wanted to bring in with regard to the virus picture. When we talk about zinc, which is the next item, it isn't quite so similar situation, but visually you can have quite a relationship between zinc deficiency and fan leaf virus. And we say, well, you have to forget about viruses till we get into them next quarter. But we have minus zinc and fan leaf virus, which are oftentimes one confused with the other. And those are the only two virus problems we have that are, at the moment, that are similar to nutritional problems. So that answers your question, whoever it was over here had this. Okay? Now we're going to talk about zinc deficiency. And once again, zinc is a micronutrient, which means that you don't need very much of it. And let me give you a sort of a graphic illustration of how much zinc you really need. If you go out here in this vineyard you've been pruning, this way back when you used to go out to the vineyard and lab, you could take an acre of those vineyards, saw them off at the ground, pile them up, burn them, get the ash, extract the zinc out of it, and how much zinc you think you might have. You have somewhere around less than a pound, maybe something over a half a pound of zinc. So you're talking about a micronutrient. So when you're talking about deficiency and trying to correct this zinc deficiency, all you're worried about is how to get 2 or 3 ounces of zinc into a vine per acre. 2 or 3 ounces of zinc per acre. And this is the big problem of fertilizer in the western United States. The big problem. Of course, nitrogen deficiency is a problem, is costly, but it's not a problem. All you got to do is have money to buy the nitrogen. But how to get zinc into many of our plants in the so-called 13 western states of the U.S., and all types of plants, annual crops as well as tree and vine crops, is a biggest single fertilizer problem. Because, for example, I told you only needed to add a difference between deficiency and sufficiency might be 4 or 5 ounces per acre. But when I applied it on the soil, under the most sandy soil conditions I had to work with, I put 750 pounds per acre in order to pick up that 4 or 5 ounces of zinc. So putting it on the soil is out of the question. So you have to figure out other methods of putting it on. But I say on many crops, whether you're talking about corn, or corn is one that shows it, or tree crops, almonds often show it, perhaps the most, walnuts often show it, and the most susceptible crop of all, I guess, is cherries, sweet cherries. So, and then grapes fall somewhere, depending on variety and rootstock, so forth, somewhere in between. So it's a big problem, even though it doesn't require much if you could get it into the plant to take care of it. Well, once again, let's diagnose it. Well, I said, what's a diagnostic symptom? That's my pattern, you know, to follow the diagnosis. Our big problem is to get zinc into the plant. And up until now, my work has been directed at that problem. And the best place to work on that is to work with plants that show the symptoms. And until we can figure out a pretty good and sure method of getting zinc into the plant that has visible hunger, why worry about hidden hunger? In other words, if you're going from a level of surplus, a surplus level down to sufficiency minus perhaps, or questionable, down to deficiency with symptoms, and then down perhaps to the severe symptoms, and this being a percent amount of zinc in the tissue, why worry about any of these until you're able to correct the ones down here? Why worry about any of these until you can find out how to correct this one? So most of our work has been working with severe symptoms or deficiencies with symptoms, and we haven't even bothered yet. It's the next project which I intend to launch out onto, is to study this whole field of whether or not we do in fact, or do not in fact, have a hidden hunger for zinc. But why worry about a hidden hunger until you can take care of the visible hunger?
How would you know how much to add if you didn't know the relative difference between them?
Well, we've got to find out if we can get it in before we worry about how much to add. If it takes 750 pounds applied in a trench like you saw with the potassium to get a recovery on extremely sandy soil, the rate of return there is about 1 in 100 or less. So that's 750 pounds of, say, 30%. So it's three times 7. So it's about 200 pounds of metallic zinc applied per acre in order to pick up 3 or 4 ounces per acre. So see, the ratio is pretty high. So that's our diagnosis then at the present time, is visible symptoms, and the whole question of whether we have a hidden hunger or not still remains to be checked out with tissue analysis and soil samples, once again to calibrate tissue level or treatment with visible symptoms. Okay, let's see visible symptoms of zinc. This first one you're going to look at is a zinc deficiency, and each one of these, I think, Mark, has to be sharpened a little bit. This is zinc deficiency, and it occurs most commonly at the terminal part of the shoot, And the common name for zinc deficiency on practically all crops in the West is called little leaf. So the leaves are going to be smaller at wherever it shows. And in grapes, perhaps, this characteristic chlorosis here is once you've seen it and recognize it, from then on it's very easy to identify this idea that you have not dying back between the veins that you saw in the potash, but as though each one of these veins had been painted with a felt pen, sort of a broad line there, often with the vein looking green, the main vein itself looking green with these, or light green, or pale or light colored, with the green edges off to the side. It's a very characteristic symptom you see. The most important thing, perhaps, is this opening up of this part of the leaf into what we call an open sinus. These serrations, like this, are called sinus. So these are the upper or anterior sinuses, and then you have the lower sinuses, which don't show too well on here, and then you have the sinus, or the area where the petiole is attached to the blade. And normally, if this is a healthy leaf, these come down in a sort of a horseshoe shape and even overlap in many varieties. But with the zinc deficiency, they pull up together like this and open up and give you this flat base. That's why it is similar to this fan leaf virus I was talking about, because I said that in fan leaf virus you have these 5 main veins, and they tend to pull together. And when they pull together, they flatten out this sinus down here also. But they don't have quite this characteristic pattern in the leaf blade itself. And they're not always terminal. And there's lots of other ways you can tell them. A zinc deficiency may occur over, as you might expect, over a section of soil, whereas fan leaf virus, being a virus, may be one on this vine and one over here a half acre away and one over here 50 feet away and so on, depending on the incidence of the virus. So it's a pattern in which you get it that often helps to tell you whether it's a virus or a nutritional problem. But terminal leaves, frequently and most commonly, like the situation with potassium, this doesn't occur until about bloom time, or really, quite often it occurs about the time these lateral buds begin to push out and make about this type of growth. And it's often on these little shoots, they're about this size, that go way on down the shoot, when they're just out about an inch or so and about a quarter size in diameter, that you see the deficiency on those as well as on these terminal leaves. Open sinus with this type of pattern, and they're very typical in this shot. Okay, next slide. And here's the effect on fruit. This is carignan, and you're not looking at the difference in color. That just happens to be the stage at which I picked the clusters. But here's a normal cluster. Here's a zinc deficient cluster. This is what I refer to as a straggly cluster. I talk about straggly clusters and poor set on muscat and so forth for much of the last 2 or 3 lectures in the morning lectures. This is a straggly cluster. And you can imagine if you multiply this by about 10,000 clusters, what a difference you get in crop between one that is not zinc deficient and a situation where you have zinc deficiency. You cut the crop down terrifically, even though it's a wine grape. If it's a table grape, of course, you wouldn't sell it at all. So this is one situation there. The next slide. This is, wait a minute, back up. Some of you laugh about that, but that's why Muscat is not sold as a table grape in California, because Muscat has to be babied so carefully with long spur or cane pruning and extreme flower cluster thinning and all these other things to get a nicely set cluster. So that's why Muscat went out as a table fruit. But a lot of people love the flavor of Muscat. And people who are Muscat lovers, and I happen to be one of them, don't care what it looks like, as long as we can get the clusters. But I can get them, but the rest of California, most of them can't, because I can walk out here at the vineyard and get them. And I get lots of friends about the time Muscats get ripe. Okay, next slide. And this one, don't bother to change it, just sharpen it a little bit. This, I think, is Palomino. And once again, it just shows, this is an extension service photo, and it just shows, again, the open and loose set and poor set that you get in shot berries that you get with zinc deficiency. Next slide. Now, okay, that gives you an idea what zinc deficiency is like. I told you it doesn't take much zinc to apply. Let's just have the lights for a moment because they can take the notes, and let's turn this one off. We'll come back to this. The next question you need to know is the incidence of zinc deficiency. Where does it show? Where do you find it? And perhaps the most important or more serious situations, and I'll put these in order of seriousness, is where you have rootstocks such as Dog Ridge, and we'll discuss rootstocks later, but this is Dog Ridge and Salt Creek. The people who've had 105 know what they mean, and these are two very good rootstocks against nematodes. But they're very vigorous rootstocks, and perhaps because of their great vigor, they are also extremely susceptible to zinc deficiency. In other words, they're strong against nematodes, but they are quite susceptible to zinc deficiency. So where you put varieties on these stocks, you can expect to have troubles with lack of zinc. Another situation, perhaps say in decreasing importance, is where you use poultry manure for fertilizer. Poultry manure as fertilizer, because there's something about using poultry manure, and all we can say at the moment, it may be because it's high in phosphorus, that causes zinc deficiency to show up. But if you put poultry manure plus a sandy soil situation, you can kill out a vineyard in 5 or 6 years from zinc deficiency. And certainly you can show symptoms in 2 or 3 years. And by poultry, I mean chicken or turkey manure or what have you. Apparently cow manure, horse manure, what have you, doesn't show up much on this. Again, and they aren't so high in phosphorus. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. It'd be interesting to try rabbit manure, which is also high in phosphorus, and see if it would cause it. But those are the two worst situations we find in the sandy areas of the San Joaquin Valley, where we run into this. Another situation, which is so small we shouldn't even talk about it, but it's of some interest, is that you find it in corral spots, or corral spots, or places where cattle or sheep or what have you, any sort of livestock, have been penned up, or even, as somebody said yesterday, a corner of a pasture where they're fed frequently, so they tend to congregate there. And there's something about these situations that causes a terrific zinc deficiency. And by terrific, I mean an absolute difference between growth and no growth. You can have a vineyard in which the vines are growing, say, along like this, and you can come up to a place where there was a corral spot back about the time you were born, and then it'll stop just within a distance like that. It's just, you can just outline the corral spot almost with a tape measure where you've had zinc deficiency, or whether you've had cattle penned up, and then plant most crops, most tree and vine crops. One crop that seems to take it fairly well for some oddball reason is olive. in one of my trials. Yesterday I made quite a point of talking to Winty from down at Livermore, because we had quite a trial in one of his corral spots, and the olive trees didn't seem to know they were supposed to be deficient, but walnut and grape and what have you were just, the walnut in particular just looked like you'd treated it with some sort of terrible hormone or something. It was just all sorts of oddball growth. So you can get this in corral spots, but the total amount of corral spots in the state of California planted to vines probably not equal to the size of the 4 times the size of the campus quad, so we don't need to worry about that. We don't know the explanation for it, so that we do have these spots of this type where we do get, and quite often on just plain sandy soils with certain varieties, just sandy soils alone, you can often get some zinc deficiency showing up, particularly with susceptible varieties. And sandy soil plus varieties such as, you can't see from here, I guess, such as Salvador is perhaps our most sensitive variety to show the visual symptoms. And Salvador shows it because it's a hybrid between an eastern species, Vitis rupestris and Vitis vinifera. And the eastern species originated in acid soil, high rainfall situations. And then you bring it to California where it's under high pH, high calcium soils and so on, and you run into this zinc deficiency. And those are the main areas, main places where you run into zinc deficiency on grapes. One thing I might add here, that speaking about Salvador, is that zinc deficiency acts a little funny in that, depending upon the variety you're talking about, some varieties show that leaf symptom first and may show it quite severely before it shows any effect on the clusters. And this would be a case of Salvador, where Salvador may show it quite badly on the leaves before it begins to really cause a straggly cluster. But you can go the reverse and go to something like Muscat, which already has a problem of set, and then have a zinc deficiency situation, and boy, you can have a terrific effect on set before it shows on the leaves. So you've got to know the variety in order to know something about it. Okay, now how are we going to treat it? I said I put 750 pounds on a sandy soil in order to get a response, and of course that's impractical on anything approaching a normal soil. So we get down to the point of worrying about other methods of treatment, and to get to the point here, the easiest and cheapest and most consistent way to get a response on a zinc treatment with a spur prune variety is just to paint the pruning wounds at pruning time. You prune them back to 2 and 3 bud spurs, and you take a broom handle or a 1x1 stick and wrap an old knit sock around it, and that's the best thing, not a cotton sock, but just a worn out knit sock, because that makes a nice sponge, and wrap it around the end of the stick. And then you dissolve 1 pound of zinc sulfate per 1 gallon of water, and then just dip your swab into it and just tap the end of these pruning cuts, tap them like this, and dip them and slop it on and soak them. And that's the best way to take care of zinc deficiency, the most sure and the cheapest way to take care of it, provided they're not bleeding. And by bleeding we mean dripping sap the moment you cut them. You have one man with a bucket and a swab following about 6 or 8 pruners, and he can go back and forth or some way, so that the sooner after you make the pruning cut that you swab them, the better. But if they're bleeding, you sometimes have to wait an hour or 2 before you can, in other words, there's no point in trying to get zinc to go back into something when there's already a flow of something coming out of it. You have to wait till that quits dripping before you paint it. And you'll read in the literature, it says that if you don't paint them within the first hour or 2, it doesn't do any good, or you hear that often. But if you go back and read the original research, you'll find that they show that, sure, the sooner you do it, the better, but if you can't get around to doing it for 24 hours, and many times it more than pays for the work that's involved in doing it. But under normal conditions, you ought to try to do it within the first 2 or 3 hours after the pruning. But that takes care of a situation where you have a vine that is spur prune, and where you're leaving maybe 2 buds, and all you're doing is putting the swab right onto this pruning cut, and the zinc moves in far enough to take care of these 2 buds. But it doesn't do much good if you've got a cane prune vine and you've got 16 buds on it, and you all the way back down here and all the way along here, all of which need zinc, and you paint the end of this little pruning wound. And remember, half of our acreage, if you take into account what we have of Thompson now, plus all the cane prune varieties that are going in for mechanical harvesting and Cabernet and what have you, half of our acreage is cane prune. So how are you going to take care of this? And therein becomes the problem, because you can't put it on the soil, it won't work. You put it out here at the end, it won't work. And if you spray it on, it's almost like flipping a coin as to whether or not you're going to get a response or not. And one of the biggest unknown things about plant physiology apparently seems to be of understanding the mechanism of how materials are absorbed from foliage spray by leaves. I did my PhD thesis on it, and I still don't know the answer. I worked with urea on apples, which works pretty well on apples, but urea doesn't work worth a darn on grapes. Why, for example, let me give you a little, just to blow your mind a little bit. Most of you are familiar with orange trees. You know they got slick, glossy leaves, and you'd think if there's any plant around that would not absorb sprayed materials, it'd be an orange leaf. Yet they control deficiencies of micronutrients pretty well with foliar sprays on citrus. Now take a walnut leaf. They look sort of soft and velvety and look like they just ought to soak up stuff like a sponge, and they won't pick up anything. Why? We don't know. We just don't know the answers to some of these plant problems. So anyway, what you have to do then, your only hope is to put on sprays. And one of the things that you want to get in your notes is that that zinc is required for setting the fruit. So you've got to get into the flower part before the flower part is ready to open, or is fully mature, so that whatever it does in that flower part, it'll have a chance to do it. There's no point going out and spraying with zinc when the flower is about 3 days before bloom. So what you want to do is spray with zinc as early as possible before bloom. And by early as possible, you say, well, you can go out and spray when they're 4 inches long. But if you go out and spray when the shoots are 4 inches long, about 95% of your spray hits the ground. On the other hand, you don't want to wait until just 1 week before they bloom, otherwise it won't have time to get in and be of any use. So you sort of compromise and spray somewhere along about 2 weeks before bloom time. With any of a number of materials, you hear a lot of comments about these chelated materials, zinc chelate, and there's several company brands for this. Geigy puts them out, and other companies do, and so forth. But zinc chelate is an organic type of zinc. And the big argument is that this goes in better, which it doesn't go in better, but that's a big argument. But perhaps its strongest argument is that it's probably a little less toxic or a little less dangerous to work with. So that it's safer, but it's about 4 times, 5 times as expensive as using zinc sulfate. So you can use zinc sulfate at about 2 pounds per 100 gallons, 100 gallons in this case now, for 100 gallons, plus a wetting agent, of course, and get pretty good response. Or sometimes that's a little bit of a dangerous gamble. Some people put on zinc sulfate at something like 4 to 6 pounds. 4 to 6 pounds per 100, with plus one half the weight of spray lime. But often it's hard to get good active spray lime along in June or May, because most of the spray lime is made up to put on peaches and other trees back at January and February. So sometimes the spray lime is deteriorated. So you might be better off to go to one of these proprietary compounds called, one of the best that I've worked with is Delmo Z. It's a California product, and it's a mixture. It's made up of either zinc oxide or zinc sulfate plus some lime and so on, and that put on at about 4 pounds per 100. That's what they recommend on the bag. Seems to be about the safest way you can treat it. Zinc chelate here might be at about, they recommend something like 3 pounds per 100 gallons. And you put this on 2 or 3 weeks before bloom, and you sit back and hope that it works. Sometimes it works beautifully. Sometimes it works pretty rough. One reason you put on zinc sulfate like this with half its weight of spray lime is that you put the lime on to keep the zinc from working. Because sometimes it works beautifully, and it really goes in nicely, which if you put on 4 to 6 pounds would give you trouble. But sometimes it doesn't go in very well, and then the lime precipitates the zinc sulfate and makes it slowly soluble, so that maybe you may get some absorption. If you have a condition of real good absorption, that prevents you getting too much. If it's a matter of getting bad conditions that day, maybe dew at night or a little light rainfall later on and so forth may make it so that you can get some absorption. I started to laugh because I was talking once to a prune grower down in the Arvin area somewhere where they do have some zinc deficiency problem. And he said he gambled one year and he put on zinc sulfate at 5 pounds per 100 with no lime. And he's sort of an oaky type, and he said, you know, I didn't have nary a leaf left on those trees. He burned every leaf off of some real expensive early plums by putting on 5 pounds because whatever the conditions were that day, it just worked perfect and burned every leaf off his trees. So that's one reason why you put on the spray lime. But I think you're safe enough to put on a much lower rate at 2 pounds per 100 and forget the lime. So that's about the cheapest recommendation I'd give. You don't want to use that, then go to something like this proprietary compound, I think put out by a Standard Oil subsidiary. Who? Ortho, by Ortho. I think Ortho sells Delmo Z. I might be wrong. Okay, but you've got to do a pretty good job of spraying. Let's look at a slide or two of this. We're really running late today. I'm keeping you guys captive audience. You see, by necessity, these people work out these various rigs that do a pretty good job of wetting the foliage. Here's a U shape that has a couple of nozzles going in from this side, a couple of nozzles from here, and a big blast on the overhead. And they're offset a little bit so that they kick the foliage and back and forth and around as they go down the row, putting on about 200 gallons per acre. Now, this is one of our trials, and we got in too late, and we knew we were too late, so we abandoned it later because this is too close to bloom. It's about a week from bloom. Let's see the next slide. And here's just a close-up of the equipment. You see, these are homemade because one of my pet gripes about equipment manufacturers is that the equipment manufacturers live in an apartment in Chicago, and the people who need them work out here in the vineyards in California, and the two never seem to get together. So that most of our really good equipment that's used in vineyards and orchards in California is homemade. Okay, so much for that gripe. But here's one that's made, you see, in which they have a nozzle up above, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 nozzles, in which only 2 in this case are acting, and 2 on the other side, and 1 up above, to give a real good job of wetting the foliage. Okay, next slide. Now here's where I did some hand work with a backpack sprayer on some really zinc deficient vines, and what I'm showing here are some shoots off of the control plant, which is next door, showing this basal sinus widened up, showing the symptoms, showing the small leaves, and one case where for some reason we got a real nice response because just about 3 or 4 weeks later after we sprayed it on, you can see a nice response. And I'm showing it more to show you the difference between zinc deficiency and a normal vine than anything else. You see this basal sinus now is in a real nice horseshoe, whereas over here they're practically flat, and they have this drawn appearance in sharp serrations and so on. So that's a good example then of potassium deficiency or zinc deficiency with the response you get over here. This is poor photography for that glistening, not the symptom. Okay, next slide. Now we're talking about spray applications, and I was talking about you know, one of the things about spray on many crops, I said I worked with urea on apples, and that's nitrogen, that's a macronutrient, and it works pretty well on apples, and it works pretty well on some citrus, lemons and so on. But we have not gotten good response with macronutrients sprays on grapes, and you're going to be subjected to all sorts of sales stories about NutriFeed and All Feed and all sorts of names that they come up with spraying on these Duke's mixtures to improve the nutrition of your vines. Here's a trial I did with one called NutriFos, which contains zinc and phosphorus, and it was supposed to do all sorts of things to the crop. Well, here's the amount of phosphorus that was on our phosphorus analysis after it sprayed 3 times, 2 weekly intervals, 1, 2, 3, and samples taken each time. And here's the controlled phosphorus, the NutriPhosphorus, and the zinc phosphorus. So we got some big differences. No, we didn't. And in fact, to try to be honest with these people, because they were supporting this with a research grant, I used 2 or 3 different methods of analyses, each one more and more sensitive, hoping I could pick up some differences, and we did not. So this NutriPhos, as so far as getting phosphorus in the plant tissue, was a joke. Okay, but the next slide shows that we did get some terrific absorption of zinc, because control here is this level of zinc here in parts per million of zinc, and you see the control was very low in zinc. But the zinc 50 and the NutriPhos both gave very high levels of zinc in these terminal shoot tips. These were shoot tips that we took. So you sprayed the whole plant and then let it grow out this far and then cut off the new growth to get clean wood, to get clean material that had not been sprayed. And you see we got very nice uptake of zinc, but this material is probably about 1/3 or 1/4 as expensive as that. And the only material advantage we were getting was in zinc. So don't get taken by too many of these materials. NutriPhos just happens to be an example, but many of these other materials aren't worth any more than you saw on that last slide also, except for the trace element. If you want a trace element, you can put in some of these materials I was talking about. Zinc 50 happens to be zinc oxide is all. That's just a trade name for zinc oxide. Okay, next slide. Okay, now let's have the lights and turn that off if you would, please. That's the end of your zinc story. Okay. I'm keeping you people real late, but if you don't go to sleep, I'll keep talking, I guess. Now the next element we want to talk about is boron. And historically in the state of California, boron toxicity has been known far longer, way back to the beginning of agriculture in California, I guess. And certainly in terms of the acreage involved in boron toxicity with all crops, the toxicity greatly has a far greater acreage involved in deficiency. And in speaking in terms of grapes, for example, we have some boron toxicity at the moment in established vineyards down in the east side of Bakersfield County, or Kern County, near Arvin. And we have a few areas of boron toxicity in the valley floor of Napa Valley and a few other areas like this. So under existing vineyards at the moment, we don't have perhaps many more acres of boron toxicity on grapes than we have boron deficiency on grapes. But the whole west side of the San Joaquin Valley, representing about 300,000 acres, is going to open up to agriculture, is opening up very rapidly, and most of that 300 acres is subject to either toxicities of either boron or, let's say, boron, sodium, and chloride. So you're going to have, we have toxicity problems then on this potential 300,000 acres, of which much of it probably will go into grapes. Well, boron toxicity, unless it gets very bad, just looks bad, doesn't hurt your crop appreciably, unless it, as I say, unless it gets quite bad. But it is something to be involved with. You're working, if you're irrigating vineyards with boron water of 3 or 4 parts per million, boron, you can begin to expect some problems. If you've got boron in the soil, of anywhere from 2 to 4 or 5 parts, 2 to 4 or 5 parts per million boron, you can expect some problems. But underneath that, for example, in the Arvin area, it's usually a matter of just looking bad rather than really causing any serious economic loss. But where we get into economic loss is boron deficiency, because whereas we may have only 2,000 or 3,000 acres of boron deficiency in the state, and much of it in areas the size of this room, up to maybe 5 or 10 acres in size, when you have boron deficiency, you just don't got no crop. It just wipes out the crop, as I'll show you in some of these slides. Furthermore, and let me give you all of this at once instead of showing you the slides first. Boron deficiency is a fertilizer research worker or a salesman's ideal dream. Not a salesman, but a research worker's ideal dream, perhaps, in that it gives, the deficiency causes such a terrific crop loss. It is so easy to correct. You don't have to put on very much. You don't have to work like you do with zinc to correct it. You can put it on the soil and it goes in very easily, and you get response right away. And it only takes about 1 ounce per vine to last you for 3 years. So the cost per acre, even including the application cost, if you put 1 ounce per vine every 3rd year, it figures out to about maybe $2 or $3 per acre. And yet, if you have the deficiency, it can make the it can make a 10-fold difference in the crop. So it's an ideal thing to work with. As I say, as far as we're concerned, it's one material that we can sit back and recommend pretty well without worrying about it. What other insurance can you get against anything cheaper than $3 an acre per year? Okay, so that's the treatment. 1 ounce per vine of any of the materials, just broadcast on the vineyard at any time you want to, but preferably during the dormant season, will take care of it. It isn't the cost of the material, it's relatively cheap. It's how to put it on, and we've gone through several stages of development on this, and to get to the point, our best and easiest way to put on 1 ounce to the vine on any considerable acreage is to put it into a spray rig and just spray it on. Just spray it on the dormant right out there today. All you're trying to do is spread 30 pounds of the acre as uniformly as possible. So the best way to do it is dissolve it in 200 or 300 gallons of water, and anybody who operates a spray rig knows how many gallons per acre they put on at a given rate, and just put on 1 ounce per vine by spraying it on vines, soil, what have you. I wouldn't put it on green foliage in the spring because we haven't tried that because it hadn't been necessary, but certainly any time during the dormant season, before or after pruning, just put it into a spray rig and apply 30 pounds per acre of any of the borax materials, and there's about 6 or 8 of them that we can name for you. And I put that on about every 3rd or 4th year, and that takes care of it.
Is it put on the vine row or just the whole acreage?
Just the whole acreage, just spread it. Just so you spread this material uniformly over the whole place, because it'll go right down with the rainfall, just like nitrate in. It'll move right down with it. Okay, now while the lights are on and you can do this, we want to talk about where you find it. And again, this is quite simple and clear with regard to boron. We got 2 specific types of situations in California where we get boron deficiency. They're covered first under the general idea of that boron deficiency occur wherever you have a very high application of low boron water. High applications of low boron water. Now, where are you going to get those? Well, obviously, you ought to say in the coastal hills, because you get 30 to 40 inches or 50 inches of rainfall, and you can't get much lower boron water than that. So 30 or 40 inches of boron water on the hillsides, and emphasize hillsides or hilltops in the coastal counties. Because where we found boron deficiency in Hopland back in 1958 was when we found it. So see it, we haven't known deficiency in this state very long on boron. It was on top of a hill up near Hopland where you could look down the valley and see a pear orchard that was going out from toxicity. And this is a situation in all this Clear Lake County area, and all this area looking that away from here to the ocean, that you can get just all sorts of a mix-up of toxicity areas, deficiency, toxicity, and so forth, depending on what little watershed or creek bed is involved in the situation. Some of them are high in boron, some of them are low. But most of the hilltops where you can get the leaching effect will show the deficiency no matter what's happening down in the valley floor.
in Napa Valley?
In Napa Valley, yes, especially on the two of our most extreme deficient places have been in those hills just exactly west of St. Helena, yeah, up in those areas there. We've had some of our most striking deficiency on those hillsides. Where you can really get it is where you have little odd outcroppings of acid soil. So in certain areas you'll have soils in which the pH runs down to 6 or maybe under 6. And under those situations of acid soil and high rainfall, you really get the leaching of boron. And that's what you run into in European situations. So in most of the high rainfall areas of the world, they knew about boron deficiency, but we sat over here complacently and didn't think we had it. We were worried with toxicity. We didn't know we could have one here and one there, one here and one there, so close together. So we were sort of asleep at the switch for a long time before we found it. But boron deficiency has been reported from New Zealand, from Germany, from France, from the eastern United States, I think also from South Africa, but I'm not sure. But for most of the big grape-growing areas of the world, they've had boron deficiency. The grape seems to have an unusually high demand for boron, even though it's in a micro amount compared to other crops. So we have this problem. Okay, so you have the deficiencies, you have the incidence areas, and you have its effect on the vine. You ready to look at some slides? Okay, let's look at slides. Wait.
You said there were two types of situations.
Oh, excuse me. Okay, good point. One in these hillside vineyards of the coastal counties, and the other is on the eastern side of the San Joaquin Valley, where you're on sandy soils and where you irrigate with water from behind the dams of the Sierras, because that water that comes out of the Sierras is also extremely low in boron. And if you have sandy soils, easily leached, perhaps acidified by putting on too much ammonium sulfate over the years and so on, remember acid soils and so on, then you can get boron deficiency developing. We have numerous incidents all the way from Jackson, up in the hills where they're planting a few vineyards, all the way down to opposite Delano against those foothills, but particularly in the Fresno County, the eastern side of Fresno County. And those are the areas quite clear. Eastern Merced County, as I say, up in the hills as far as Jackson, all along there. I think some of the early vineyards that were planted up in these hills, Placerville, Jackson, and so forth, that went out, probably went out from boron deficiency because of the lack of crop, as you'll see in a moment. Okay, any more questions? Let's have the slides in, if we could, Mark. And here's boron deficiency. And again, it's a micronutrient which shows up terminally. We're going to talk about 4 micronutrients this afternoon: zinc and boron and iron. All 3 are micronutrients, and all 3 show on the terminal parts of the shoots. Write that down. And the 4th one, manganese, Mn, another micronutrient, is the only one that shows on basal leaves, which I'll show you later. So I have 4 micronutrients, 3 show terminally, and the 4th one shows basal. But none show quite so striking at the terminal part as boron, because you can go from an apparently healthy leaf, maybe a little bit of deficiency showing right here, and the very next node, the leaf becomes extremely deficient, and then very rapidly this shoot stops to grow and dies. The terminal growing point will die. So you can have 4 feet of growth back here, and all of a sudden, the very tip of it, just as though you'd grafted some oddball plant on the end of it, it'll suddenly develop these symptoms, and then within just a few nodes, it will die. And you get this very straggly, poor set of fruit along with it. Yeah. Now, we know in the case of boron why you get a poor set of fruit with boron, because a lot of work has been done on this in Western Germany, and boron, deficiency of boron prevents pollen tube growth or germination, pollen germination. Deficiency of boron's specific role in the case of grape is to prevent the germination of pollen. And if you have a seedy variety that requires fertilization, the pollen tube growing into the flower. If you don't have boron, the pollen tube doesn't grow, and you have an impotent flower, and then you don't get set. Or if you do, you get set, you get parthenocarpic berries. Next slide, please. This is just another shot showing you the same thing, practically, I guess, from just a different view. A normal leaf, and then all of a sudden the deficiency, and then the death here. These internodes get closer and closer together. Sometimes they just go by halves. You may have 3-inch, 2-inch, 1-inch, ½ inch, and then they stop. And you get this type of thing. And on a red variety such as Carrigan, I didn't show you on the last leaf. I don't know whether that shows it or not, but this yellow will turn red on a black variety later on. Next slide. And here's Thompson seedless, upside down, but that's all right. It shows, again, the primary shoot and the death of the growing point out here. And then sometimes when that happens, it's just though you top the vine with a machete, and then somewhere back down below you may get a lateral taken off, which may be all right, because you only get a few laterals to grow, and maybe there's enough boron to supply those few laterals later in the summer, the warm soil and what have you. Maybe this will grow 5 or 6 feet long, and this will be pushed off the side and be only 2 feet long. And then you'll say, well, this isn't boron deficiency because Cook said it had to be terminal. And there's nothing, no deficiency out here. But if you go back far enough and check it out, you'll find out this was the primary shoot, and it was terminal on it. See the sandy soil on the east side of San Joaquin Valley. Next slide. And here is another example of the effect of boron. I said that potassium deficiency will show up under waterlogged soils and also under drought. But boron deficiency will also show up under drought conditions. Boron deficiency is much worse under drought conditions, and of course that makes these hillside vineyards in the coastal counties doubly susceptible to boron deficiency. So first is the fact that their soils are well leached, and then secondly they're not irrigated in the summer. And I've been trying to tell these people that for since 1958, that anybody has a hillside vineyard in the coastal counties ought to spend an average of $1 per acre per year, $3 every third year, to put boron on his vineyard, because he's probably suffering quite a crop loss, either from drought or from low boron or both. But you can't, some farmers you can't tell anything to. But I come from a long line of them, I know. So now one of the other problems you run into is that not only does low water supply bring on boron deficiency, now get this clear, but boron deficiency makes the vines more susceptible to drought and heat injury. So see, it works both ways. Boron deficiency, low soil moisture makes boron deficiency worse, but boron deficiency lessens the vine's ability to withstand heat and drought injury. And that's how we got involved in this problem in the first place. This is what we were called in to look at, where you had a whole vineyard with a lot of this real dead tissue like this staring at you, and when it should be looking good. And then we began to look around, saw this death of growing points and these symptoms, and took leaf samples and finally diagnosed it as boron deficiency. This came from the coastal counties. Okay, next slide. And here's the effect you can get from treating with boron. This is, again, now we're back on the east side with Thompson seedless. And this was one of the first plots we put in. And we got this type of response, from changing from this to this by putting on 1 ounce of 20 mule team borax, bought in the Safeway store, in the furrow before the first irrigation. In 1 year, we changed this Thompson seedless vineyard from about a 5 pounds per vine vineyard to about a 25 pound per vineyard with this type of fruit as compared to this. We were getting about 5 pounds per vine of this stuff. These are set parthenocarpically because I said the pollen tube doesn't grow. It doesn't germinate. And these berries are just barely hanging on. And if you take that cluster and hit it like that, it'll look like that. They just fall right off. So sometimes with boron deficiency, you can get a crop that looks like it's going to be a decent crop. But if you've got other types of shatter from poor nutrition, carbohydrate nutrition, so what these flowers fall off shortly after bloom. But sometimes with boron deficiency, they don't fall off till they get half ripe. And then a wind comes up or something, and off they come. So this is the type of results you can get. Okay, next slide. And here is a more a definite experiment in which we put on an experiment on about 55 rows of about 4 or 5-year-old Carignan, again over on the east side of the San Joaquin Valley. We went in the year before we put on the experiment and harvested it and weighed the fruit per vine. 4 or 5-year-old Carignan vines, and we were getting 2 to a maximum of 11 pounds per vine. You don't make much money at that rate, even at $800 a ton. We're getting an average of about 4 pounds per vine. We went out then after we picked it and during that winter and put on again a 1 ounce of borax per vine. And the next year, from 59 to 60, we jumped the crop up to here. With 30 pounds of borax per acre, worth about $1.50, $2 worth of borax, we raised the fruit production from an average of 5 pounds to an average of over 20 pounds. Isn't it a nice story? So that's the story of boron. I think, is that the last slide on boron? No, it isn't, because that's boron deficiency. Now, there's another side to it, and I told you the boron toxicity. And here are the symptoms you get when you put on too much. That first vineyard that we found up in Hopland, where I said I stood in the vineyard and looked out and saw the toxicity down in the valley, had toxicity the next year on the grapes. Because when we told this grower that an ounce per vine or so would be all right, he figured 4 ounces would be fine. So he put 4 ounces per vine. So next year he almost burned them up with borax. Getting back to my opening initial statement about micronutrients, that they are a type of thing that a little bit is required, but you can easily overdo it. Remember my story of iodine. So here's a matter of toxicity. You can treat them with an ounce per vine and get nice response. You go out and put on 4 ounces per vine, or maybe 3 ounces per vine on a sandy soil, and you can run into toxicity problems. And this is the symptoms of toxicity most clearly right here. That boron rushes to the leaf blade and accumulates in the margins. And if it accumulates early enough, before the leaf gets too big, it kills the cells at the margin, but it doesn't kill the ones in between, and they keep dividing, and they have to go somewhere. So they buckle, and they buckle up and down to give you this wavy appearance that you see on the young leaves. The next slide. This, by the way, quite closely resembles some of our herbicides damage, so you have to be sure you haven't treated the vines with too much herbicide, or you get that type of symptom. Over here you still see some of these leaves which were young when they accumulated too much boron. This is the type of thing you get in the older leaves as they accumulate more and more boron. You get that's a pretty bad picture, isn't it? You get speckling. You get black specks around the edges first, and then they finally coalesce and give you these complete necrotic areas. But perhaps the most important thing is with the real excess boron, you burn off all these little tips, all these little serrations, because there's where it really accumulates first, in those little tiny sawtooth edges along the edge of the leaf. And that's an example of boron toxicity. You can have quite a bit of this type of symptom before you do much damage to the cropping of the fruit. But if you have the slightest symptoms of boron deficiency, you're in trouble. Next slide. That's the same, yeah. Yeah, you're going. I think that's the last of the boron series, isn't it? No, there's one more. Always have to bring Mexico into this. And here's a vine in Mexico that was planted in an area that was really high in boron, and about half the vines had already died. But you can see the effect of excessive boron on a vine in an active growing situation. See how it's burned off all these tips? All the leaves are cupped or crinkled. So, and this vineyard was on its way out. As say, over half the vines were dead from just one thing, too much boron. But he just took that to do it. And that was native in the soil or in the water. I didn't have time to find out in that particular area. Okay, that's all on boron. Now those are your main ones that you've got, that you really need to worry about if you're really worrying about culture of grapes in California, if you're going to go into the business. See, I keep remembering that about half of you are going to plant your 40 acres, build your little winery, plant premium varieties, make the best wine there is, and get rich. So I'm trying to help you do that. Now we want to discuss some of these other minor problems with fertilizers just briefly, so that for one reason or another, as I go through, I'll tell you why I'm telling you about them. So you know, you don't need to take too many notes on them, but you may want to take a note or two. So let's go right into those, Mark. We're rapidly running out of time, putting them to sleep. Now, is this zinc deficiency? It looks like it, doesn't it? What is it? What's wrong with it? The sinuses, you see. Now, these sinuses are not flattened. They're not flattened out at all. The symptoms look quite a bit like it. This is manganese deficiency, Mn, not Mg, but Mn, manganese deficiency. And the reason I'm showing it to you, it is not important in California, seriously, except that it's, to many people, it so closely resembles zinc deficiency in its overall leaf appearance that you might run out and spray and daub and everything with zinc when you just had a little trace of manganese deficiency. So it's useful for you to know which one is which. And manganese deficiency has a symptom similar to zinc. It does not normally cause little leaves. It doesn't normally cause any measurable effect on crop. And the most important point of all, it occurs on the basal part of the shoot. That's that fourth micronutrient that I was telling. So I told you 3 micronutrients terminal, 1 micronutrient basal. And let's see the next slide, Mark, and we show them that. And here is some people yesterday were looking confused. This is a grape stake, and the trunk of the vine is down in here, and the vine goes up in here, and you've got these manganese deficiencies showing on these older leaves, generally, but not always, in the shade of the vine, in the shady part, the lower basal part of the vine. But sometimes you can see a little bit even out on the exposed areas. But it's generally basal and in the shade. And you see there's no evidence here of open sinuses. So that's why I'm showing you manganese, because of its similarity to zinc, and you should know and should remember the difference between the two. You saw that on old midterms, you better know it. Next slide. Here's iron deficiency. This is Salvador, the variety that is the hybrid with eastern species, and you see the difference between the symptom of this and of zinc deficiency. It's much more yellow, and the green lines are much more finely drawn or finely outlined in these leaves. And that's iron deficiency. It's common in many parts of the world on grapes. It's common here in California only on concords or something that's related to eastern varieties. Remember, these eastern varieties are, once again, originated on acid soils. And where iron, under acid soil conditions, iron is quite readily available, so that their native origin requires a readily available iron. You bring them out to a high pH situation here where iron becomes a little more of a problem, and wham, they show the deficiency. So this is iron deficiency on Salvador. I doubt if you'll ever see any in California. But you ought to know what it is and what causes it. Here we call it lime-induced chlorosis. That's an old term for it. I think more recently they'd call it bicarbonate, HCO3-induced iron deficiency. But that's involved in the calcium or lime being present in the soil too. We're not going to give a course in soil chemistry, but anyway, it's bicarbonate, HCO3-induced or lime-induced chlorosis. And we don't have much problems in California because most of our soils only run about, not more than about 5% free lime. And you say, well, that might be quite a bit, but when I give you the soils lecture, I'll point out that vineyards are grown in Europe on soils that run 50 to 60% chalk, like this. And still, by using the right rootstock, which is the best control for iron deficiency, by using the right rootstock, they don't have any problems with iron deficiency.